Hashem, today's Daf Yomi is Zevachim Nun, Zevachim 50, but we're going to start on the last line of Mem Tesem Abayz. The last line of Mem Tesem Abayz is continuing the discussion. The Gemara is discussing four different ways of deriving an exegesis from the Torah. What are the four ways? The four ways the Gemara is discussing are all Hekish. A Hekish is a comparison. If there are two passages that are written next to each other in the Torah, then we compare the laws basically by the proximity. The Gzera Shava is when there are two words that are the same in two different paragraphs, so we compare the laws of the two paragraphs. Then there is a Kal V'chomer, which is a logical argument, which is basically if A is stronger than B, if B is stronger than A, and C is stronger than B, then C is for sure stronger than A. And then there is the Binyan Av. The Binyan Av is basically just comparing two different aspects of the law. And the problem with the Binyan Av is if there's any distinction whatsoever, then the comparison breaks down. So then the Gemara is discussing different permutations. Let's say you derive one law through one of these four methods. Can you then use another law from one of these four methods to derive a second law? Or meaning you have law A, and then you learn out law B from law A using one of these methods. And now you want to learn out law C using a different one of these methods derived from law B. Meaning, is it too attenuated or does it work? So the Gemara is discussing that. And so now on the bottom of, and we're going to actually spend the next 2 days discussing this. Something that is learned out through what's called the Hekish, the comparison, Choser Mu'ame B'Kavachomer, can then turn around and teach something else to a Kal V'chomer. And the Gemara says, we already learned this in our tractate on top of 50a. We learned this in back on Daf Mem Amabayz, that Tanan Rabbi Shmuel taught that we learned out specific laws about sprinkling the blood of the goat in Yom Kippur from a Kal V'chomer from the goat of Avodah Zarah. Even though the goat of Avodah Zarah itself was learned out just from the bowl of the anointed Kohen through a Hekish, or a comparison. Next law is Davar Alame Behekesh. The Gemara asks the question, something that is itself derived through a comparison. Malashi Yalamed B'Binyan Av. Can it then go and teach through a Binyan Av? Through a less, it's not it's a comparison, but not through proximity. So I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. So if Rabbi Yirmiyah says, well, I have a problem with that. If that's the case, that something that's learned out through a Hekish can go and then teach through a Binyan Av. Well, if that's the case, why is there a specific verse by the Karban Asham telling us that it should be slaughtered in the north? When it says in the place where you slaughter the Oah, there you should slaughter the Asham. Well, Lichtov Tafona B'Asham, it wouldn't have needed to write it by the Asham, but Teisi mi Binyan Av Mechatas, and you can just learn it by comparing the Asham to the Chatas. So so why was it specifically written? Isn't to tell us the Davar Alama Behekesh and Choser Mu'amed B'Binyan Av? Isn't it to tell us this idea that something that is derived through a Hekish cannot then go and teach through a Binyan Av, and so therefore it needs to be written by the Asham explicitly? The Gemara says, well, if that's your case, if your logic is that we can't learn out the case of a Binyan Av, an Asham, through a comparison to Chatas or Binyan Av, but we would have been able to learn out an Asham directly from an Olah by doing a Binyan Av to an Olah. My time will say, why are we not able to do that? Because they're not the same. You could draw a distinction because Mala Olah Shekain Kalil, because the Olah is entirely burnt, unlike the Asham. Chatas Nami Iko Mifrach. And so also for that logic, you can say there's no Binyan Av to a Chatas. Mal Chatas Shekain Mechaperes Achayve Krisus, because the Chatas serves as an atonement for a Kares penalty, which the Asham doesn't. Now the Gemara, according to Rashi, is basically going on a little bit of a tangent and say, why does the north need to be written in all three sacrifices, the Oah, the Asham, and the Chatos? Okay, I understand you can't learn out one from the other, but Teisi Chada Mitarti, but just write it by two of them, and then you don't have to write it by the third. Gemara says, Mehai Teisi, by which one of them should we not write it? And we could have derived it. Well, Nechto Rachmana. So he says, Or nechto rachmana bechatos. Maybe the Torah doesn't need to write it by a chatos. V'teisi mehanach. Maybe the Torah doesn't need to write it by a sin offering, and you can learn it out from an O and an Asham. That you can't do. Malahanach shekain zacharim. That you wouldn't be able to do because a chatos is a female animal. Excuse me, I skipped a line. Maybe the Torah doesn't need to write it by an O, and you can learn out from a sin offering and an asham. You can't do that. The chatas and the asham, they provide atonement, whereas the oah does not provide atonement. It's not coming to provide an atonement. Even though we do know that the oah in certain circumstances does provide some atonement, it's a lesser form of atonement. Because the chatas and the asham atone for a negative commandment, whereas the o is for a positive commandment. So do you want to say, well, maybe the Torah shouldn't write it by the sin offering, and you learn out from the others, from the o and the asham. The o and the asham are male, whereas the chatas is a female. Also, maybe the Torah shouldn't write it by the asham, and you learn out the asham from the chatas and the oah. No, that wouldn't work either. The asham is only an individual offering, whereas the oah and the chatas are both also communal offerings. So you can't learn out one from the other two, and so therefore all three have to have their own separate thing. Then the Gemara says another principle: davar lama b'gzeira shava, something that is learned through what we call gzeira shava. Ma'oshi lama behekesh, can it then turn around and teach through a hekesh, through a comparison? Rav Papa says, well, we're going to learn this out from a Thanksgiving offering, because it says by a Thanksgiving offering, Zos Torah Zevach Hashlamim, Ima Toda Yakrivenu. And so the Torah compares the carbon Toda to carbon Shlamim. Amanu Toda Shaba Min HaMaiser. This, and from here we learn that from the fact that the Toda, we learn from here that Toda is allowed to bring it from the money of Meiser Sheni. From the fact that the Shlamim can also be brought from a Meiser Sheni money. And so since the Toda is compared to the Meiser Sheni, we learn that the Toda itself can be brought, Toda is compared to a Shlamim, we learn that the Toda can be brought from Meiser Sheni money. But Shlamim Gufayim Minau, and how do we know that the Shlamim itself is brought from a Meiser Sheni money? They'll siv Sham, because we compare it to the to Ma'aser Sheni has the word Sham. And so we see from here that the Shamim, which is derived from Gzeira Shava, can then go teach the Toda that can itself be brought from Ma'aser Sheni through Gzeira Shava, and then it can teach through a Hekesh to the Thanksgiving offerings. So it says Marzutra, Bredra, Mar Ravina, Ma'aser Dagan Chulam Ba'almahu. That's not you can't prove our question because there's a source law there is Meiser Dagam, which is starting out with Meiser Sheni grain. That's not sacred, that's chulin. And so therefore we want to know this law by sacred items. So Amra Lama Kodesh Umalame Kodesh. So he says the one who taught this teaching that by Kodshim, that something that is learned out cannot go out and teach, he didn't say it where both the Lamed is Kodesh and the Melamed is Kodesh, meaning to say the original one doesn't have to be Kodesh. The original one could be Chulin. So it's not a contradiction to that basic idea. So now we go to the next point. Davar Lamed B'Gzeira Shava, something that is itself derived through Gzeira Shava, Ma'oshi Lamed B'Gzeira Shava. Can it then go turn around and teach through Gzeira Shava? Meaning to say something that's derived through a common word, can it then go and teach through a common word? Tanya. Well, we're going to learn this with respect to the loaves of bread that are brought with the carbon Toda. We know that there are 4 different types of bread that are brought with them. 3 are matzah and 1 are chametz. And the 3 types of matzah are chalos, which is the loaves, the rikikin, the thin wafers, and the revucha, where he sprinkled boiling water on the dough. And it says by the revucha, soas mur beches. It should be from the soas. Amanu revucha shaba misoas. So the revucha loaves have to come from the finest flour called soas. Chalos minayin. How do we know that the chalos loaves have to also come from the soas? Tamlomar chalos matzos. And it says by revuchos chalos. So therefore, we learn from here that just like the revucha comes from the soas, also the chalos, because it's exer shava to the revuchos and rikika minayin. And how do we know that the thin wafers also tamomer matzos matzos? So that is derived from the chalos. That's compared to the chalos. So we see that chalos is derived through exer shava from the Gemara is over there. Good morning, Bill. Gemara is itself are derived from exer shava from the revuchos. And the chalos are derived through exer shava from the revuchos, and the rikikin are derived from exer shava from the chalos. So we see from here something that's learned out from exer shava can then go and teach you exer shava. So Amar Ravina mimai de matzos michalos gamar. How do we know that the exer shava for rikikin is derived through the word matzos by comparing it to chalos? There's a different place where it also says soas. Maybe it's learned out from the word matzos that's written by something that's baked in the oven by itself. It says soas chalos matzos, and also by ortike matzos. So maybe, therefore, it's not derived going back all the way to the revuchos, but it's not going back to the chalos derivation from the revuchos, but to the separate word of mafei tanur. So the Gemara says, okay, I'll bring you a different proof that something that's derived through what's called a gezerah shava can then go and teach you a gezerah shava. Amoy Rava Tanya, we're going to learn this after a brayta. It says with respect to the burning of the bull of the Kohen HaMashiach, it says, and the skin of the bull and all of its flesh, you have the kirbo ufersho, and its innards and its weights. You have to hotzi, you have to take it outside the camp and burn it on the wood and fire there. Hotzi implies that you all take it out at once. You take out the bull of the Kohen who did a sin, you take it bull out complete and then burn it. I might think that you should burn it complete. I know you have to take it out complete. I might think you have to burn it complete. It says by the bull of the Kohen Mashiach, its head and its legs. And it says by the Ola, the Rosho, it says also Rosho Kra'av. Mala'alan ayidei nituach, just like by the Ola, it says through the cutting up. Afkan ayidei nituach. So we compare the bowl of the Kohen Mashiach to the Ola. Just like the Ola is cut up before it's burned on the altar, so too is the bowl of the Mashiach. Maybe by the Ola you're required to skin the animal before you put it up. I might think by the power of the Kohen, you also have to skin it. No, you don't skin it, you just you burn its flesh without skinning it. My Talmudo, how is that imply it? How does kirbo for show? Says Rava Shekashem Shepirasho Bakirbo Kach Basar. Just like its waste is in its skin, it's in its meat, so too its flesh is in its skin. Okay, so then the Gemara says Vitanya, but we still haven't proved this proof that something that's learned out from Xer Shava can then go and teach you Xer Shava. So Rabbi Omer Nemer Khan or Ubasar Uparish. So it says by the bull of the goat of Yom Kippur, the skin and the flesh and the waist. V'nemer Lalan or Ubasar Uparish. And it says by the bull of the Kohen Mashiach, on top of 50b, the bull and the flesh and the waist. Malalan Ayidei Nisuach. Just like by the bull of the Kohen Mashiach, it's burnt through cutting it up without skinning it. So too the bull and the goat of Yom Kippur, Ayidei Nisuach, Shlo B'Havshek. So it's through cutting it up without skinning it. Anyway, we see from this price that the law of the bull of the goat of Yom Kippur, you need to cut it up before you burn it, and that's learned out through Xer Shava from the bull of the Kohen Mashiach, which is itself learned out from the law of the Ola. So we see from here something that's derived through Xer Shava, you then go and teach to another Xer Shava. So now the Gemara says the next case, Davar Lame B'Xer Shava. And we're going through all 16 possible permutations. So now the Gemara says something that is itself derived through Xer Shava, can then go out and teach you a Kavachomer. So the Gemara, ironically, is going to answer this question through a Kavachomer. Where it says, I'll answer it through a kavachomer. Ma hekesh, just like a hekesh. She'eno melamed behekesh. Just like a hekesh, which is weak in the sense that it's not able, if something was derived through proximity of one passage to another passage, it's called a hekesh. It's not able to go out and teach to another hekesh, like we learned from Rava earlier. Kasher Yuram by the bull of the coin of Mashiach, or Ravina, or we learned it out from Ravina, we learned it out from the Asham Mitzora, comparison to a Chatas and an Oa. Either way, nevertheless, Milamed b'kavachomer, it can teach through a kavachomer. So that's the case. Miditane dvei Rabbi Yishmael, like we learned earlier. This is summarizing what we learned earlier by the goat of the idolatry and the goat of the Kohen of Mashiach, which was learned from a Hekesh. So just like a Hekesh cannot go and teach through a Hekesh, and a Hekesh is lighter, but it can teach through a kavachomer. Gezerah Shava, which is Milamedes Behakesh. Gezerah Shava, which is strong in that it's, if something was learned to Gezerah Shava, can then go and teach you Hekesh, as we learned from Rav Papa back on Amud Aleph. Eino din shetulame b'kavachomer. For sure, it should be able to teach you a kavachomer. Gemara says, but not everybody accepts the position of Rav Papa that we said on the earlier daf. Those who don't accept the position of Rav Papa, what would you say? Ela kavachomer. So we're going to say it's a kavachomer. Ma hekesh she'ein milame behekesh. Just like a hekesh which cannot teach through a hekesh, something which was learned from a hekesh cannot teach. Imi derava, imi deravina. U'milame bekavachomer can teach him a kavachomer with tana debei Rabbi Yishmael, like we saw at the top of Nun Amud Aleph, which was back on Daf Mem. Zera Shava hamolamedes b'gzera Shava chaverta. Gzera hamolamedes b'gzera Shava chaverta, but Gzera Shava, which is able to teach you another Gzera Shava, Eino din talame b'kavachomer, for sure it should be able to derive through a kavachomer. So the Gemara says, okay, so that's a strong proof that something that is learned through a Gzera Shava can go then teach you a kavachomer. What about Davar alame b'gzera Shava ma'ashi lame b'binyanav, something that's derived itself through a Gzera Shava can then go and teach through a binyanav? Remember, we said binyanav is the weakest form of comparison. It's just comparing two things in the Torah. But if there's any distinction between them, you can't do it. So Gemara says, take it. We leave that question unresolved. Davar lame b'kavachomer ma'ashi lame b'hekesh. Let's say there's something that's learned out from a kavachomer. Can you then teach through a hekesh, through a law of proximity? So Gemara says, kavachomer. We're going to derive that from a kavachomer. Gzera Shava she'eno made be'akesha, just like a Gzera Shava that is weak in this sense that once it's derived, you can't go and teach. If it was initially taught through a hekesh, you can't then go and teach a Gzera Shava. Rabbi Yochanan, like we said back in yesterday's daf from Rabbi Yochanan, milame be'hekesh, but it still can teach through a hekesh. So Gzera Shava cannot be initially learned out through a hekesh, but it can teach you a hekesh, midra papa. Kal v'chomer halame me'hekesh, a kal v'chomer which can be come from a hekesh. Meaning if it was originally taught through a hekesh, it can then go and do a kal v'chomer. Return very strong. Enodin sheyilame be'hekesh. Can it for sure to be able to go and teach you a hekesh? Gemara says, again, this only works if you follow the logic of Rav Papa. Gemara says, okay, if you don't follow Rav Papa, we don't know the answer. Take it. Next case, Davar alame b'kavachomer, something that's derived through kavachomer, ma she'ilame b'gzera Shava. Can you then go and teach through a Gzera Shava? So if you learn something after a logical argument, can you then go and take it to the next step through a Gzera Shava, through the word comparison? So the Gemara says, Kavachomer. Ironically, we're going to prove this through a Kavachomer argument. You had a question, Bill?
Stronger to weaker, stronger. So if something is strong in one place, and it's stronger in another place, then definitely it goes towards
No. So let me just review the laws. Basically, the Kal V'chomer is just a logical argument that if something, if Kal V'chomer is from a lesser to a stronger, Gzera Shava are two words that are the same. A Hekesh is a comparison between passages that have proximity, and Binyanav is a comparison between two laws in the Torah, but they have to be the same. And if you draw a distinction, you can't do it. So the Gemara says, Davar lame b'kavachomer. If something is derived to a kavachomer, can it then turn around and teach to a gzera shava? That's the question that the Gemara is asking. So the Gemara says, kavachomer. Let's prove that whole argument through a kavachomer. Ma gzera shava she'eno l'meida be'kesha. Gzera shava, which itself is not learned out through a hekesh, through a comparison, meaning to say, if you learned the initial law through a hekesh, you can't then go out and teach a law through a gzera shava like we learned from Rabbi Yochanan. But malame b'gzera shava, but it can teach to another gzera shava from the Rami Bar Choma, kavachomer, a kavachomer, halame b'hekesh, a kavachomer which is itself derived through a hekesh, meaning to say that you could go back and learn, meaning to say that if you have a kavachomer, which is derived itself initially through hekesh, miditani be'ishmo, eno din she'yilamed b'gzera shava, can for sure go out and learn through a teacher gzera shava. So now the Gemara says the next case, davar lamed b'kavachomer, ma'al she'yilamed b'kavachomer. Let's say can you have a double kavachomer? If you learn out one thing from a kavachomer, you then extend it to another kavachomer. The Gemara says kavachomer. Ma gzera shava she'eno made back, just like a gzera shava that if there was a law that was initially learned through a hekesh, you can't then go and learn a gzera shava from that law to another law. Mid Rabbi Yochanan, we learned that from Rabbi Yochanan, and nevertheless we learned maybe kavachomer, something that was initially learned from a gzera shava can go and teach you a kavachomer. Keda Amran, like we just said, kavachomer, alama mehekesh, kavachomer, which is a law that was derived from a hekesh, midtani be'rishmo, eno din she'yilame b'kavachomer. Meaning to say a law that was initially learned out through a hekesh, you can go and then teach you a kavachomer. You can go and then teach using a kavachomer, like we learned from the case of Ta'an Be'rishmo, eno din she'yilame b'kavachomer. Kavachomer for sure, you should be able to do another kavachomer. The Gemara comes up with the idea of Zel kavachomer ben kavachomer. This is a kavachomer that is the offspring of an initial kavachomer. The Gemara says, no, it's not the offspring of an initial kavachomer. It's ben binoshel kavachomer. It's the offspring of a kavachomer. Because the initial law was itself. Why is that? Meaning to say that first you have the general rule that you can learn a kavachomer from something that was learned from a kavachomer, and that was from two kavachomer, because we have with the initial principle that the gzera shava can be derived from a kavachomer, and also this whole idea is also only learned from a kavachomer. So we have the grandchild of a kavachomer. So then I don't know. I will admit that it's a little bit. We're on the bottom of Nun Amud Beis. So the bottom of Nun Amud Beis. So the Gemara is discussing this idea. So the Gemara wants to know something that's derived from a kavachomer. Can it go back and teach through an additional kavachomer with a middle case of a kavachomer? Ma hekesh she'eno lamed. So the Gemara is going to bring a different proof. Ma hekesh she'eno lamed behekesh, just like a hekesh, that if something is derived through a hekesh, it cannot go back and teach to a hekesh. Both, that was a point that was proved from Rav and Ravina. But malame the kavachomer, something that was derived through a hekesh, can go and teach a kavachomer. We learned that from the case of Tan Devei Rishmal. Kavachomer, halame mehekesh, a kavachomer which is itself derived the initial law from a hekesh, which can then go about and teach. Tan Devei Rishmal, eno din she'ilame the kavachomer, can for sure go and teach to a kavachomer. Zel kavachomer ben kavachomer. So, okay, so I mean, this is the daf. Let's just say, like, what's the message here? The message is that even though a lot of these laws seem random to us, the Gemara is saying that there are laws, and this is that we have to follow these laws, and that's it. That's it's not random. And if we understood the laws perfectly, we would be able to make these derivations. So we've been studying these laws for several days, and we're thinking, oh, they're all random. No, they're not. They're specific laws, and we just don't understand them. I'm talking about myself well enough to apply them perfectly. But if we understood them they're laying out here the laws, which is in the Bryce of Rabbi Shmuel that we say in a few minutes upstairs. Anybody have any questions about this? Okay, so we have one more day of this types of laws, and then we go on to the next Inyan.